After a great deal of dithering, Europe agrees on an energy tax, but only if the rest of the world follows suit. Good evening. The authorised version has it that the European community is proposing a global tax to try to deal with global warming. But is a decision to raise an energy tax in Europe only if the rest of the world does likewise the positive leadership the community claims? I'll ask Carlo Repedimiana, the Environment Commissioner, and the American government's chief negotiator on climate issues. Will America duck the challenge? In Afghanistan, Mark Urban rides through the territories of the Afghan warlords to assess the chances of lasting peace and gets an exclusive interview with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. Out in space, 3 shuttle astronauts are about to attempt a triple spacewalk to recover a damaged satellite. We'll have live pictures. And as 30 mountaineers reach the top of Everest within an hour, is it time to decide that because it's there is a good enough reason to leave it alone? We'll be joined by Doug Scott, the 50th man to stand on the summit of Everest. The European Commission, so ready to make rulings about matters like lawnmower noise, confronted the survival of the planet Earth today. It decided to do something once somebody else had done something. That after-you approach to the introduction of an energy tax is being presented as a compromise between environmentalists and big business, which will enable the European community to retain the high ground in the debate over global warming. But an energy tax will only be introduced if competitors like Japan and the United States do it too. That, said the German Environment Minister, wasn't a step forward for the community, but backwards. Nicola Karslaw reports.
Two and a half years ago, the air was thick with warnings of impending environmental disaster as the impact of the greenhouse effect sunk home.
It's comparable in its implications to the discovery of how to split the atom. Indeed, its results could be even more far-reaching. Mr. President, the evidence is there. The damage is being done.
This apocalyptic vision isn't shared by all the scientists in the field today. But according to one of Britain's top climatologists, the balance of evidence is that the planet is warming and that use of fossil fuels is at the heart of it.
What we know is that there is a natural greenhouse effect, without which the temperature at the surface of the Earth would on average be about 30 degrees Celsius lower than it is at the present time. We also know that carbon dioxide is a very important greenhouse gas, and we know that since the Industrial Revolution, mainly due to the burning of fossil fuels, carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases have been increasing steadily in the atmosphere.
In October 1990, Europe committed itself at the Second World Climate Conference in Geneva to stabilising carbon dioxide at 1990 levels by the year 2000. But they didn't say how they'd do it. Today, the Commission could have thrown Europe behind a firm pledge to introduce a carbon tax. Instead, they'll delay implementing one until the United States and Japan agree to it. Carlo Repedimiana, the Environment Commissioner, put a brave face on what looked suspiciously like a cop-out.
Today's decision has been taken with the unanimity of the members, and that makes me considering that the Commission has adopted a wise and fighting stance.
The carbon tax would start next year at $3 a barrel of oil equivalent, the units in which energy is measured, and rise by $1 each year until it reaches $10 a barrel by the year 2000. The theory is that as the price rises, so consumers will be forced to use less carbon-producing fuel. The tax is split, so that in the case of oil, half of it is based on the carbon content of the fuel and half on the energy used, a blanket measure to raise all energy costs and therefore encourage fuel efficiency. Nuclear fuel has no carbon and therefore would attract a tax of just $5 for each unit of energy. Coal, on the other hand, has more carbon and is therefore taxed higher. It would attract a tax of $9 for its carbon content and $5 for its energy content, making a total of $14. By the year 2000, the carbon tax would raise up to 60 billion ecu a year across the community, which could be used to cut other taxes. The new tax would clearly have an impact on consumers. It's estimated that the price of petrol, for example, would rise by 6p a gallon and diesel 11p. But even if the idea of extra costs proves unpopular with motorists, any opposition pales into insignificance when compared with the roar of protests from the mass ranks of Europe's industrialists. They've launched what's probably their most powerful offensive yet against an EC proposal. Even though the Commission has promised exemptions for many of the heaviest energy users, like steelmakers, industrialists have been fighting hard to defeat the measure. They argue that while only 13% of global carbon dioxide comes from the European community, almost twice as much comes from the United States, and the Americans are totally opposed to targets on CO2 emissions.
It is in nobody's interest to have such a tax. What is in all of our interests is to cut emissions from carbon. It is very important that we do that in order to preserve the environment. The question is, you have that objective, how are you actually going to achieve it? And a blanket tax like this will do nothing.
At a time when the rich North is trying to persuade the Third World to save its rainforests and help reduce global CO2 levels, environmentalists say Europe's "you first" attitude to a carbon tax is disastrous. Instead of leading the way to the Earth Summit in 3 weeks' time, the EC is seen to be dragging its feet.
The EC was undoubtedly brave to have put forward the notion of a carbon energy tax. Having made it conditional, they've essentially deferred to George Bush whether or not something should happen. And George Bush's record on environmental protection is far from perfect, to say the least. And essentially the EC have abdicated responsibility for doing anything about it. And as a result, will send the worst possible message to developing countries.
Well, though the compromise on an energy tax was denounced by the German Environment Minister tonight, the British Environment Department told Newsnight it fully supports the proposals. The community is supposed to be committed to cutting emissions to 1990 levels by the year 2000. So how seriously does the compromise weaken Europe's position? A short time ago, I asked the EC's Environment Commissioner, Carlo Ripa-Damiana.
I wouldn't call it a compromise. I think that it's a courageous and clear-cut legal proposal with binding value if accepted by the Council. And I think it is a major turn in the environmental policy. It is clearly asking the other major partners, those who, by the way, are the greenhouse gases producers, as the United States and Japan, to do their duty.
Commissioner, can the target of reducing emissions in the year 2000 to 1990 levels be met without this tax being imposed?
No. All our studies and research are convergent on this point. Without
are you then saying, Commissioner, that if the United States and Japan do not bring in a similar tax, the European community will not meet that target?
No, I don't say this. I, at the contrary, say that at this stage we introduce a conditionality clause because we want to put bluntly the problem to the other major partners without leaving them in a kind of limbo. They recognize the phenomenon, and so we say, we are ready to go ahead. What are you doing?
Well, the American government has so far resisted all pressure to introduce energy taxes to reduce carbon consumption. Will today's decision in Strasbourg make any difference? I'm joined by the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Environment, Robert Reinstein. He joins us from a studio in Ottawa. Are you going to accept the proposals for a tax, Mr. Reinstein?
Could you repeat the question? We don't have a good line here.
I'm so sorry. Are you inclined to accept the EC's proposals for a carbon or an energy tax?
I think at this point, given the state of the economy, it would not be very popular at all in the United States.
But sometimes leadership requires you to do things that are not popular. Are you inclined to do it?
I think that our leaders, and I'm not one of those who would make this decision, but I think our leaders in both parties are disinclined to propose such taxes today. There was a debate among the Democratic presidential candidates a few months ago over the question of a rather modest increase in our gasoline tax. It was not supported by any of them, except one said it should be considered, but all the others strongly disagreed.
Well, now,
the Congress has not been inclined to consider such taxes in recent years at all.
Well, now, if you're not inclined to accept it, then presumably the EC tax won't be put into effect. How then do we in the developed world try to lecture the developing world on why it shouldn't cut down rainforests when we won't do anything like that to try to reduce our carbon emissions?
Well, I would disagree that we're not doing anything. We're doing quite a lot of things, and in fact, the United States laid out a series of measures that we have already committed to. We issued a paper about 2 weeks ago entitled The U.S. Views on Climate Change that listed about 3 pages of actions that taken all together will reduce our overall emissions of greenhouse gases by between 7 and 11% in the year 2000 relative to what they otherwise would have been. Now, that's a pretty significant reduction.
Do you accept that there is a need to act much more drastically than that? We are, after all, talking about the future of the Earth.
Well, we are, but we need to look at the timing and magnitude of proposed threats, and we need to look at the relative cost of proposed actions and try and balance out those two. And at this point, we see certain measures being justified and others not at this point being justified in light of the science and our best understanding of the economics. And we have laid out a number of actions that we think make sense today. They achieve significant reductions. Taxes are not among them.
So it wouldn't trouble you whether the European community brought in this tax or not, despite the fact that you heard the European Environment Commissioner saying that without this tax, the European community couldn't meet its own declared target for the millennium?
Well, I don't think it's up to us to say that the Europeans should or should not tax their citizens. And I don't think it's up to them to say whether we should or should not tax our citizens. We can consult on this matter, but it is a matter that Europe should decide for Europe and the United States should decide for the United States.
Mr. Reinstein, thank you very much for joining us. The Russian foreign minister was in Kabul today trying to negotiate some return to normality after the fall of the puppet government his Moscow predecessors installed. It was some mark of the state of relations that the Russians inquired about an alleged 100 prisoners of war and the Afghans handed back precisely 1. But relations with Moscow are taking something of a back seat while the Afghans sort out relations among themselves. The ceasefire between the different guerrilla groups is still holding, but so too are the suspicions. Mark Urban travelled from the northern border towns down to Kabul and encountered the Afghan warlords preparing for tribal civil war.
The transformation of the Mujahideen into a government is proving bloody indeed. Earlier this month, dozens of people were killed by artillery in a power struggle between rival groups. For the bereaved, it was a hollow triumph. For the moment, there's a ceasefire, but now many people in Kabul expect the killing to resume. The Oxus River marks the border between Afghanistan and the former Soviet Union. It was across the Friendship Bridge that 3 years ago the last Soviet soldier left.
The Soviet-backed government in Kabul has now fallen, and a war which lasted nearly 14 years and claimed anything up to 1 million lives is over. But what future for shattered Afghanistan? We'll be travelling nearly 300 miles along the Salang Highway to Kabul. Along the way, we hope to find out whether this really is peace at last and what future direction this nation will take.
The route from Hairatan to Kabul was the jugular vein of the Soviet army in Afghanistan. It's still a vital trade route. The highway runs across the featureless expanse of the Oxus Plain, through the Samangan Desert to the Salang Pass, the key route through the Hindu Kush mountain barrier. It then goes down through the Shomali Plain to the capital, Kabul. On our way, we hope to find 4 of the key players in the future of Afghanistan. General Rashid Dostam, Uzbek warlord of the north. Syed Jafar, a provincial governor whose forces dominate the northern approach to the Salang. Benon Sevan, the United Nations mediator still trying to bring about the peaceful transition to a democratic state. And Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, head of the Hezb-i Islami, or Islamic Party, the man who's threatening to bring down the current coalition in Kabul. And so we began, in a helicopter furnished by General Dostam, skimming across the Bactrian desert towards the principal city of northern Afghanistan. The Air Force in this region has simply been absorbed into the warlord's empire. At Mazar-e-Sharif's centre is the mosque, built supposedly on the tomb of Caliph Ali. It's a Sunni place of worship dedicated to a Shia prophet, an Afghan fudge which would be frowned upon in some other Muslim countries. In the gardens, Dostam's Uzbek militiamen feed the symbols of peace. Their comrades now secure Kabul. They played a key role in taking it for the Mujahideen, and that's given Dostam a strong hand against the Pashtuns, the southerners who've traditionally dominated Afghan politics. At the local commander's HQ, the flag of Najibullah's republic has yet to be replaced by one of Islamic green. In pursuit of the general, I waited among the supplicants outside the commander's office. The Mujahideen around the city were invited to join in a coalition, supposedly of equals. Once inside, we received a clearer picture. The man behind the big desk, an Uzbek colonel, holds the real power. Those on the sofa, a collection of Mujahideen and army commanders, simply lend their authority to him. After a few moments, our interview with his boss was arranged. Dostam's fortress headquarters is a relic of the ebb and flow of Central Asian empires. He was given control of large parts of the north by the former leader, but in January, Dostam defected from the government. Scores of tanks, thousands of troops and dozens of aircraft are now at the general's disposal.
We overthrew Najibullah because he did not reward the efforts of the armed forces in the north. He didn't trust the party members here and wanted to move his own people in.
Would you ultimately be prepared to fight to safeguard the interests of the people of the north?
Everything started here. The armed forces and the Mujahideen in the northern provinces were vital to the victory of the Mujahideen groups in Kabul. The leaders in Pakistan and Kabul must not forget this.
The general has stayed in the north, keeping in touch with his troops and envoys in Kabul by radio. A private fiefdom is emerging, exemplified by Dostam's attitude to his new president in the capital.
Do you regard Professor Mujdidi as your commander-in-chief?
Until our delegates return, I cannot comment.
Our journey resumed. Where the mountains begin, the highway slips into Alexander's Gate. Legend has it that that ancient conqueror used this gorge during his campaigns, which took him deep into this inhospitable massif. We drove towards the province of Baghlan, a buffer zone of ethnic groups ruled by Syed Jafar, a man put in place to protect the Salang Road when the Russians left. Many of the villages along the Salang Highway were destroyed in fighting. At Gulgarak, the ruins were heavily mined in an attempt to stop Mujahideen ambushing the road. Most of its pre-war population remains in Pakistani refugee camps. The Halo Trust, a British charity working with the UN, is now trying to make the village safe. A British expert leads Afghans in this unenviable task.
At the moment I'm looking for tripwires. In this sort of vegetation, tripwires can very easily get tangled up in the grass as it grows, and so they're very difficult to find. If I didn't find one, and the detector man came up and swung his detector head into it, the likelihood is that he'd set the mine off.
It's not long before their patience is rewarded.
What have you got here then, Tim?
We've got a POMS here, which is a fragmentation mine operated by a tripwire. And you can see the other side of the mine. The tripwire goes down into the canal and up the other side. The green pineapple-y bit at the bottom is a fragmentation matrix, and the silvery bit sticking up at the top is a fuse. And then it's all held out of the ground on a bit of wood at the bottom.
How are you going to deal with it?
With that sort of mine, I wouldn't do anything except put a charge onto it and destroy it in place.
In nearby Omar Khel, one soon spots mine casualties. Several villagers from Gulgarak are now waiting here to see if they can go home. Their assessment, and that of other people like them, will determine whether the world's biggest refugee population, up to 5 million people, goes home. It soon becomes clear that mine clearance and rebuilding will be in vain if growing tensions produce a new civil war.
Nobody will return until Dostam disappears and a proper Islamic government is established. During the years of the communist regime, Dostam killed thousands. As long as he is associated with this government, our people will never return to their homes.
These people are Pashtuns, one of the small number of such communities in the north, and they regard Gulbuddin Hekmatyar as their protector. They're quick to distance themselves not just from the government in Kabul, but also from their provincial governor. Syed Jafar is the unlikely 27-year-old ruler of this area. Heavy metal, a taste acquired during his education in Britain and America, accompanies his progress through Pulakhumri, the biggest town in Baghlan province, with an armoured personnel carrier and security men in attendance. On arrival at the base of his division, Jafar is met by officers who enforce his will on the area. There's a strong tradition of local independence from Kabul, and Jafar has aligned himself with General Dostam and the other northern ethnic minorities.
Would you expect General Dostam to be given a senior position in government?
This is a right answer that everybody knows. Definitely he should be, because everybody knows that who started this movement.
And if he wasn't given one, would that be an injustice, do you think?
You say that if he didn't, but this is impossible.
Over lunch, Jafar received reports from the troops he had dispatched to Kabul with Dostam and Massoud's men. They were keeping him up to date on the power struggle, prompting our own departure. Our journey took us towards the Salang Pass. 13,000 feet up, blizzards are frequent even in May. The Hindu Kush Mountains formed the final barrier to 19th century imperialists, Russians to the north and British to the south. Today, they mark the edge of what General Dostam can consider home turf. On the long descent, we saw several villages destroyed by the Russians just before they withdrew. They were trying to undermine the power of Ahmad Shah Massoud, the guerrilla commander whose troops now dominate the area. His men staged many ambushes on this road, But now Massoud is defence minister and the link man between Dostam's northern coalition and the leadership in Kabul. As we completed the last stretch of the road towards the capital, we wanted to track down General Dostam's militiamen and find the United Nations mediator, Benon Sevan, one of the people trying to prevent the ethnic tensions of North and South turning into a new war. During our absence, fighting between General Dostam's militia and the forces of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar had continued. On Martyrs Hill, resting place of the regime faithful, Dostam's tanks lobbed shells towards the suburbs of Kabul still held by the government's opponents. Down below, in the contested city, people fled the return fire of troops and guerrillas loyal to Hekmatyar. In the shattered streets, many fighters helped themselves to loot. Dostam's men have a reputation for thieving, a sin which the Mujahideen are also guilty of, but which is exploited by critics of the Uzbeks in the increasingly tense ethnic climate of the capital. The United Nations was trying to bring about a peaceful transition when the Mujahideen took over. Now, in the compound where Najibullah is believed to be in hiding, the UN's chief negotiator fears growing tensions could shatter the current ceasefire.
More than ever, the ethnic issues are coming to the fore. And if that happens, it's going to be a disaster. It's going to be like a volcano. This is something to be avoided by all means. It will break up the country into pieces. And if the country is broken up into pieces, it will be like an earthquake. And you know very well, earthquake does not recognize borders. It will affect the whole region.
The one issue which we've found consensus on, from General Dostam to the Pashtun nationalists, is that Najib should stand trial in this country. Do you think, realistically, that you're still going to be able to keep your bargain with him and get him out of the country?
The position of Mr. Najibullah, or the status of Mr. Najibullah, is a secondary issue. The most important on our agenda, and there's only one item on the agenda, is to bring peace to Afghanistan. And I do not wish to see the status of Mr. Najibullah to be a reason for adverse effect on the peace process.
You are saying, though, that if a suitably formulated request came from the Afghan government, you would hand him over tomorrow?
Well, we'll cross the bridge when we reach there.
Just to the east of the city is the Polishaki jail. When the regime fell, 12,000 inmates were freed. Guerrillas supposedly loyal to Professor Mujahidi's government now hold the prison. They've been removing valuables too. In theory, they're allied to Dostam. In fact, as Pashtuns and Mujahideen, they can't stomach the thought. Groups like this could switch to Hekmatyar, boosting him politically despite his ejection from Kabul. Their commander couldn't conceal his sympathies.
Dostam must leave Kabul. His men are out of control. They kill. They loot. I've told the president. It's time we invited Gulbuddin Hekmatyar into the city. He, after all, is a mujahid.
We decided to travel 40 miles further east in search of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's hideout, a journey which would take us to Sorobi, where we hoped to find a man winning the support of an increasing number of Pashtun guerrilla groups. The road east plunges through the dizzying Kabul gorge and down towards Sorobi. This route gained a fearsome reputation for ambushes and banditry during the Soviet occupation. We drew closer to the army base taken over by Hekmatyar near the town. Our arrival was signalled by a Hezbi Islami foot soldier.
The BBC.
From that point on, we were not allowed to film the troops who guarded him, and our interview with one of the shrewdest and most feared politicians in Afghanistan was conducted inside his tent.
Why is the presence of those troops of General Dostam unacceptable to you when it is acceptable to Ahmad Shah Massoud, for example?
I think they should not be acceptable to anyone. They are thieves. They are murderers. They are killer of Afghan people. Their hands of blood on the people's blood. They are supporters of a communist regime.
It would seem, though, if he goes, that when you want to dismantle his organization, to take him and arrest him, that's going to be a big war, isn't it?
So now we are insisting that they to leave Kabul, to withdraw from Kabul. What to do in the future, that is a question of future. We will see what to do.
Some people are saying now that there is a big danger of an ethnic war developing between Pashtuns and people from the north, and saying also that you yourself might be at the head of that Pashtun element. What's your response to that?
I should say that this is an issue developed by BBC. And there is no ethnic problem in Afghanistan at all. So all those who have entered Hizb Islami as members, they have chosen Hizb Islami because of their ideology, their line of thinking. They feel that Hizb Islami is capable to run the affairs of the country, to make a strong government, to serve their nation.
At the end of our journey, it's clear that the time of peace has not yet arrived in Afghanistan. The violent conflict between General Dostam and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar could well frustrate the attempts of the international community to rebuild this country. Neither of these warlords has yet explicitly turned it into an ethnic war, and the prospect that they might is indeed a frightening one, because then Afghanistan could be confined to an endless war.
Minute, what to do when the summit of Everest starts to look like Snowdon on a bank holiday afternoon. First, though, some of today's other news. Union officials in Germany are privately conceding that the public sector pay deal they recommended is close to being turned down by the workers. And in Hesse, private sector pay talks between the Metal Industry Union and the Employers' Federation have broken down without agreement. The Los Angeles district attorney is to ask for a retrial of one of the 4 policemen acquitted in the beating of the black motorist Rodney King. He told reporters that justice was not done in the case. The United Nations peacekeeping mission in Yugoslavia is scaling down its command headquarters in the Bosnian capital Sarajevo because of the security situation. 200 UN staff are to be temporarily moved out, leaving about 100 there. The father of a teenage girl who committed suicide has reacted bitterly to a police report suggesting that bullying wasn't the reason for her death. The case of Katherine Bamber from Kidderminster had prompted a national campaign against bullying. On the markets, the 100 share index closed down 2 points at 2720.5. In New York, the Dow Jones was up nearly 7 points at just over 33.91. On the foreign exchanges, the pound was up 0.5 cent against the dollar at just over $1.81, and it was up 1/5 of a pfennig against the German mark at 2 marks 94.4. Now, it might seem a small step for man, but astronaut Pierre Thuot has been making heavy weather of NASA's attempted rescue of a communications satellite over the last 3 days. Well, twice Thuot has failed to pull in the satellite, which the Space Shuttle Endeavour is trying to retrieve and relaunch into its proper orbit. NASA has faced criticism recently for the extravagance of the space program and was only too pleased to accept this $93 million contract to restore the satellite in time for this summer's Olympic Games coverage. It won't welcome the embarrassment, however, if tonight's third and final rescue bid involving a 3-man spacewalk instead of the custom-made mechanical arm ends in failure. And those astronauts are expected to embark upon their spacewalk at any moment now, and I believe we can be joined now from the Johnson Space Center, Houston, by Barbara Schwartz. Ms. Schwartz, has the spacewalk actually started yet?
Yes, they have, and they are in the payload bay, and they're getting ready to, they are building the structure for one of them to stand on, and we expect them to be able to try the first time to manually capture this in about, 40 minutes from now.
When one saw pictures of the last spacewalk, to try this operation, it looked as if it was almost a stationary operation, that both objects, both the shuttle and the satellite, were stationary. They're not, are they? They're traveling terribly fast.
17,500 miles per hour is the speed of our shuttle, and yes, when they're station keeping with the satellite, they're both traveling in the same direction at the same speed.
Now, assuming that at that speed the three of them manage, or one of them, between them, they manage to make contact with the satellite, they then draw it into the shuttle. Is that the idea?
That's correct. All three of them are going, they're standing 120 degrees apart, and when the commander gives the go, they'll all three grab at once and stop the satellite and hold it stable while one will go underneath and attach the capture bar.
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, here we have this incredibly high technology of these billions and billions of dollars, and in the end it comes down to three people standing in space grabbing at something.
Isn't that something?
Are you confident they're going to manage it this time?
Yes, I think so. I think everyone feels like it's going to happen this time.
Ms. Schwartz, we wish them the best of luck. Thank you very much for sparing the time to talk to us.
Oh.
Thank you. Well, now, if during this bout of brilliant weather you're tempted to get away from it all to somewhere really remote, don't, whatever you do, think about Mount Everest. 40 years ago, it might have seemed as remote a place as you could find on Earth, but yesterday, no fewer than 30 people reached the summit, which must make it busier than some bus stops in this country. Sir Edmund Hillary, the first man to get to the top, says reaching the summit nowadays is like a bus tour of Wales. Everest, Chomolungma, remains the symbol of man's greatest physical endeavour, the eternal invitation to meet a challenge just because it's there. It's not the most difficult mountain to climb, although at least 60 people have lost their lives trying to beat it, but no other peak has the cachet of the mountain the Nepalese call the head of the sky. The most famous to perish was the intrepid schoolmaster George Mallory and his partner Andrew Irvine. Dressed in a style now considered more appropriate to a summer afternoon on Ben Nevis, they disappeared heading for the top in 1924. The breakthrough came nearly 30 years later with the New Zealander Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing. The image of two lonely men at the top of the world is as memorable as the first moon landing, but it disguised the enormous organization which got them to the top.
We had our base camp at the foot of this huge icefall, known as the Khumbu icefall, with blocks the size of cottages here.
George Band was the youngest climber on that famous expedition.
Up here we had our Camp 7, then on towards the South Col, Camp 8, at just over 26,000 feet. And it was from here that in 1953, Hillary and Tenzing, with the supporting party, put their final tent at about 28,000 feet on the southeast ridge. And from there, on the 29th of May, over the south summit to the peak itself.
Where Tenzing and Hillary led, large numbers have followed. Between 1953 and 1975, 50 climbers made it to the top. Since then, another 450 have done it.
Coming to 5, for page 80, Everest.
As climbing in the Himalayas becomes more popular, once solitary endeavour is shared by the world's couch potatoes. The latest expedition to Makalu, the world's 5th highest peak, comes with a live satellite link.
It's much more remote than Everest. It took us 3 weeks to walk in here.
This expedition has 17 members, 1 satellite, and £250,000 worth of sponsorship. If the mystique of climbing the world's highest peaks is diminishing, the same cannot be said of the amount of trash left behind. Since Sir Edmund's climb, there have been more than 250 expeditions, each leaving, on average, as much as 3 tons of rubbish. At high altitude, the ice preserves it for all posterity. In a backlash against the big expeditions, some climbers have abandoned all the paraphernalia and returned to the alpine style. No fixed ropes, no oxygen, no Sherpas, no large groups, just the climber and the mountain. But with the Nepalese government only too keen to encourage more climbers, and with increasing numbers of experienced guides, some of whom have been to the top of Everest half a dozen times, the mountain's likely to get even more crowded.
A lot of climbing on Everest really has become a commercial undertaking. There are lots of people who would like to stand on top of the mountain but don't have the experience or skill to do it. And they are taken over by perhaps a couple of experienced mountaineers who recruit them, and these people have to pay $35,000 US, and in due course, with a little bit of luck, they are conducted to the top.
Climbers have always believed, like Blake, that great things are done when men and mountains meet. Because technology gives greater comfort than could help the pioneers, doesn't necessarily devalue the individual achievement. Larger expeditions do make it easier, but they demand a more rigorous code.
Expeditions of this kind should only use kerosene or camping gas for fuel, and the rubbish should be buried or burnt or carted away. They should follow the motto of the American Sierra Club, take only photographs and leave only your footprints behind.
This week, there are a record-breaking 17 sieges on Everest. The Pakistan government wants all peaks over 8,000 meters to be given a year's holiday from climbing. But Nepal, one of the poorest countries in the world, needs the foreign currency. Next on the horizon, Everest Disney. Joining us now from a studio in Carlisle is Doug Scott, who with Dougal Haston was one of the first two British people to stand on the summit of Everest. Doug Scott, do you think Everest is losing its special mystique?
Well, I don't think those 30 people that just climbed it would think that, but they're over the moon and still higher than Everest.
Do you think that for any of them the experience is diminished in any way? They were all there actually within an hour of one another yesterday. Is it diminished by numbers?
Well, again, not for them, but I mean, I do feel fortunate that when we were climbing it, and in fact on all the Himalayan peaks up to 7 years ago, there was just yourself there. But since then, the Nepalese, as you were saying, have taken away all restrictions on access. So now any amount of people can go who can pay the royalty fee.
Now, you climbed both with big expeditions, like the classic Bonington in 1975, and also you've made these small alpine-style ascents. Is it time to call a halt, do you think, to the great sieges?
Well, I think that's always got to be a matter of individual choice. Personally, I gained a lot from that 75 trip. It was a very happy expedition, and we all learnt a lot about high-altitude mountaineering. But obviously, seeing as climbing is about facing up to uncertainty as well as risk, once you know you can do it that way, you want to go next time in much smaller numbers and tackle it more adventurously.
Sir Edmund Hillary was suggesting there it had become almost a commercial operation, that in a sense the technology and the safeguards now make it almost too easy.
Everest will never be that easy. Don't forget there's only 25% of the oxygen up there that you've got down in London at sea level, and that every step of the way is going to get more difficult.
Are we exaggerating the environmental damage done?
Probably not there. I think really the Nepalese ought to look to, say, Switzerland. I suppose 100 years ago in the Alps, that's just where the Himalaya are now, and the Swiss managed to cope with the vast number of tourists that went to the Matterhorn. And obviously there's going to be differences. It's a poor third world country, there's corruption out there and so on, but I really do think the Nepalese government have got to intervene to some extent to restrict the numbers going to Everest, and they've also got to put up some facilities, certainly toilets take care of the human waste, which is pretty appalling now, I gather, around Everest. I mean, right now there must be...
Toilets actually on the mountain?
Well, I think the mountain takes care of its own waste. It soon gets buried in the snow and disappears for many years until it comes out at the snout. But right now there must be some 500 people milling around Everest Base Camp, and that's a lot of people. I do think they've got to provide some facilities if they are going to allow all these numbers to come in.
Doug Scott, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And some late news. Police in Coventry are describing the situation on the Wood End estate in that city as tense after a second evening of disturbances. A petrol bomb has been thrown into a police van. About 60 youth are said to be involved in the incident. A quick look at one or two of tomorrow morning's front pages. The Times: EC seeks fuel tax to cut global warming. The Guardian: assets of Serbia face freeze throughout the European community, they allege. Government targets EC critics as an attempt to rally around the Maastricht treaty, shortly for debate in the House of Commons. Le Monde takes on Brussels, that's attempts to cut the European community budget. Le Monde rejects EC budget rise in the Financial Times. And The Sun with the news of a speech by ITV's, or BBC actually, Pam Armstrong at the Cambridge Union, which is said to have shocked all sorts of people. That's it from Newsnight for tonight. Don't forget breakfast news is at 6:30 tomorrow morning. We'll be back at 10:30 tomorrow night. Join us then. Good night.